Rome remembers builders. Of roads, of laws, of victories. Maecenas built nothing. No temples bear his name. No armies marched under his banner. And yet, the age he lived in, the one we still call golden, shaped itself around the space he quietly occupied. He had no title, no command, no hunger for power at least, not the kind Rome understood. But in the smoke of civil wars, when Caesar was dead and Octavian not yet Augustus, Maecenas appeared like a strange solution. A civilian among generals, a man of silk in a city of steel. He offered nothing Rome was used to valuing. Only vision, taste, judgment. And somehow, that was exactly what the empire needed. This isn't a story of rise and fall. It's a story of influence without rule. A man who shaped rulers, poets, and policy, and left behind no heirs, only echoes. Rome was bleeding. The Republic had collapsed under its own weight. First to Caesar, then to knives, then to chaos. Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir, was only 19. Too young, too careful, and surrounded by men who knew only how to kill. He needed allies, not more blades. He needed someone who could see the war behind the war. The war for legitimacy. Maecenas stepped forward. Not with troops, but with a mind sharpened by distance. No uniform, no lineage worth boasting. Just a strange serenity, like someone who understood Rome better than it understood itself. They met in private. Often, no one recorded what they said. But shortly after, Maecenas was everywhere. The public couldn't see, negotiating with generals, smoothing over crises, drafting letters that sounded like Augustus, but weren't. He had no official role. But when things broke, he was sent to fix them. In a city of strong men, Maecenas offered something radical: judgment over aggression, balance over ambition. And for a time, Rome listened. He wasn't born to power. Maecenas came from Etruscan stock, a people Rome had long ago conquered and absorbed. Old nobility, perhaps, but not Roman nobility. That mattered. He was wealthy, yes, educated, well-spoken, but he lacked the one thing that Rome demanded from its elite: pedigree. He would never be a consul by right, never enter the Senate as an equal. But there was freedom in that. He moved between worlds, aristocrats, equestrians, poets, generals, and none could fully claim him. He had no faction, no inherited loyalties, only perspective. Where others competed for titles, Maecenas watched them compete. He saw how power was wielded, how it corrupted not through evil, but through repetition. And while Rome taught its young men to speak in courts, Maecenas learned how to listen in rooms that mattered more. That made him dangerous and useful. Because he came from the margins, he saw the cracks in the center. There was no announcement, no parade, no election. One day, he was simply there, at Augustus's side, and then behind him, and then instead of him, when the emperor left Rome in his hands, not as a regent, not as a consul, not even as an official. Maecenas had no mandate, only trust. And in the Rome of civil survivors and glory-hungry veterans, that trust was a more dangerous currency than gold. He became the man Augustus listened to when no one else could speak freely. The man sent to negotiate with Antony. The man who quietly rewrote the public version of events so that they sounded like fate, not compromise. He didn't shout, ever. He didn't promise. He asked questions and let others bury themselves in their answers. Rome, a city obsessed with rank and titles, never quite knew what to do with him. He held none of the usual power. But when he spoke, doors moved. They offered him the consulship. It was the pinnacle of Roman public life. A year in command, a name etched into calendars, a legacy sealed. Maecenas said no. not out of modesty, not out of fear, but because he understood what Rome still didn't. Titles come with obligations. Visibility comes with limits. A consul must stand before the Senate. He must speak often, take sides, wear the uniform of order. Maecenas preferred motion, ambiguity, the freedom to step in or step away as needed. Power was useful, but being seen holding it? That was a trap. His refusal wasn't passive. It was strategic. He didn't want to be in the records. He wanted to shape the minds who would write them. In a city built on ambition, Maecenas chose influence without exposure. And by stepping aside, he stepped behind everything. Rome was a city of noise. Trumpets, crowds, decrees, trials, men fighting for attention the way others fought for land. Maecenas never raised his voice. He didn't need to. While others shouted policy, he cultivated tone. While generals paraded, he hosted poets under fig trees, letting words ferment before they hardened into legacy. He didn't command soldiers. He commanded trust. People came to him not for orders, but for judgment. Not for ideology, but for interpretation. His home became a second capital, not of laws, but of vision. And in that quiet, the empire began to reshape itself, not through conquest, but through narrative, not by force, but by atmosphere. He proved that silence, carefully placed, can redirect the course of power more effectively than a legion on the march. There was no sign on the door, no schedule, no titles, just a room in his house. Cool stone floors, shaded light, cushions scattered in lazy geometry, and voices. Horace was there, so was Virgil. Propertius came and went, brilliant and unstable. They read aloud, interrupted each other, mocked each other, listened. Sometimes Maecenas said nothing for an hour. Sometimes he stopped a poem after 2 lines. Not with scorn, with curiosity. Why this word? What are you afraid to say? What does Rome need to hear? This wasn't patronage. It was design. He wasn't commissioning art. He was shaping narrative infrastructure. The poets thought they were writing for themselves. They were writing the emotional architecture of the empire. And Maecenas, without orders or deadlines, was quietly engineering belief. Not with speeches, with a well-placed silence in the middle of a verse. From the outside, it looked effortless. A wealthy man, funding poets. A few verses here, a patron smile there. Harmless, aesthetic, decorative. It wasn't. Rome had emerged from blood. Civil wars, proscriptions, brothers killing brothers. The Republic was dead, but its ghost still stalked the streets. What Augustus needed wasn't just peace. He needed legitimacy. And Maecenas saw what no general saw. Legitimacy isn't declared. It's felt. And feeling is built in language. So when Virgil wrote of Aeneas, he wasn't just inventing a hero. He was burying old loyalties beneath divine purpose. When Horace praised moderation, he wasn't being wise. He was offering Rome a way to live again without shame. This wasn't art as ornament. It was ideological resuscitation. And Maecenas didn't do it with slogans. He did it with taste, with direction masked as freedom, and with poetry sharpened into architecture. This was not a circle of writers. It was a cultural flank in the reassembly of empire. Virgil was no propagandist. He was hesitant, philosophical, almost shy. He didn't want to glorify bloodshed. He wanted to understand it. So when Maecenas encouraged him to write Rome's epic, he didn't say, "Make Augustus look great." He said, "Make Rome worthy of what it's become." And so came Aeneas. Not brilliant, not joyful, burdened, reluctant. A man who carried the gods, his father, and history, but rarely smiled. He wasn't built to inspire ambition. He was built to legitimize authority. Every sacrifice, every divine sign, every moral dilemma was Rome justifying itself to itself. And Augustus? He appears not in name, but in promise, a golden future foretold by fate. It was subtle, elegant, dangerous, because now Rome's future wasn't just political. It was mythological, and anyone who opposed it wasn't rebelling against a man, but against destiny itself. That's what Maecenas orchestrated. Not a poem, but a spell. If Virgil gave Rome its myth, Horace gave it something harder: permission to exhale. He had fought for the wrong side. Brutus. He'd lost. He'd returned to find a Rome full of winners who didn't feel victorious. Enter Maecenas. He offered Horace not forgiveness, but relevance. Not commission, but clarity. Horace didn't write of gods or destiny. He wrote of olive trees, of cheap wine, of knowing that time passes and you are not owed anything. In a city still flinching from memory, Horace whispered, "It's okay to enjoy again, but do it simply. Do it wisely." His odes were not calls to glory. They were emotional stabilization. And that was exactly what Maecenas understood: that a people traumatized by civil war needed not just new rulers, but new rhythms. Horace didn't lead armies, but he rebuilt Rome's internal clock, and Maecenas gave him the silence in which that rhythm could return. At first, it felt clean. Maecenas offered space. The poets filled it. Rome healed. But nothing in empire stays clean. The more influence Maecenas gained, the more he had to decide what beauty served. Was it still art? When it soothed the powerful? Was it still poetry? When it kept people calm at the cost of truth? There were whispers. Propertius resisted certain themes. Ovid would one day be exiled for lines too free, too playful. Even Horace's modesty could be read as instruction. Stay quiet. Stay measured. Don't provoke. Maecenas never gave orders. But omission can echo louder than command. He had built a new voice for Rome. But sometimes that voice avoided what needed saying, not because he was cruel, but because he believed stability was fragile and words could shatter it. He wanted peace, but perhaps in making it sound beautiful, he also made it untouchable. And once beauty hardens into doctrine, it stops asking questions. He was chaotic, brilliant, impossible to direct. Sextus Propertius didn't write about duty or destiny. He wrote about obsession, flesh, unraveling, while Virgil built marble gods, and Horace poured quiet wine. Propertius burned. He wrote of Cynthia, real, imagined, both, as if love were illness and art the fever chart. And Maecenas? He let him stay. He gave him money, time, and space, but never quite embraced him the way he did the others. Because Propertius refused to play Rome's new melody. He clashed. His verses undermined the calm. They reminded Rome that people were still impulsive, still wounded, still wild. Maecenas didn't silence him, but he didn't amplify him either. And that was the beginning of a truth. Even in a golden age, not every voice gets gilded. Some are kept at the edge, necessary for balance, but never quite welcome at the center. He rarely appeared in public. He spoke softly, and not often. But his letters, they moved borders. Maecenas wrote not as a functionary, but as a voice behind the curtain, editing the empire's self-image in real time. Some were sent directly to governors. Some passed through Augustus's hand before becoming edicts. Others arrived in poetic form, verses that shaped memory more than any decree. When news came of unrest, he didn't deploy troops. He crafted phrasing, tone, what would be said and what wouldn't, because he knew Reality isn't what happens. It's what people believe happened. And belief is language's battlefield. He understood how to make failure look strategic, how to soften cruelty, how to substitute order for justice. In the minds of millions, that was his genius and his danger. Rome bent because of him, not under pressure, but under narrative. And sometimes that bend was permanent. He had no office, no seal, no legal right to command. And yet when Augustus left the city, Maecenas governed it. Not officially, not ceremonially, simply because no one else could. He settled disputes between rival senators. He calmed uprisings. He received foreign envoys who weren't told why the emperor's shadow wore perfume instead of armor. He made decisions that shaped Rome's direction. Without ever being elected to anything, others held power visibly. Maecenas held it structurally. Like gravity unseen, constant, inescapable. This frightened some. It confused others. Because Rome didn't know how to name a man who didn't want to rule but couldn't be dislodged. He was too useful, too wise, too quiet to provoke, but too central to ignore. And that tension between no title and total influence wasn't an accident. It was his design. Because the moment you name power, you give people permission to take it from you. People called it a retreat, a place for pleasure, poetry, and polished conversation. Terraced hills, flowing water, shade, wine, music. But the Garden of Maecenas wasn't an escape. It was a machine, a cultural engine built not of gears, but of atmosphere. Here, narratives were field tested, poems rehearsed before they reached the public. Ideas drifted like incense, some vanished, others stuck to the empire like gold leaf. Nothing in that garden was accidental. The way light hit the columns, the mix of guests, never too political, never too soft. The timing of a performance, the silences between debates. Maecenas ran the place like a composer. He tuned people. He didn't demand content. He created the conditions where certain content thrived. And that made the garden more powerful than any forum. Because by the time Rome heard a poem, it had already passed through something invisible, his curation. It looked like leisure, but it was statecraft by invitation only. He could influence poets. He could soothe emperors. He could tune the voice of an empire. But he couldn't hold her. Terentia, noble-born, sharp, restless. His wife, his undoing. They married, separated, reconciled. She betrayed him. Everyone knew Rome loved that kind of scandal. And still, he couldn't let her go. Friends begged him to cut ties. He didn't. He wrote to her, waited for her, took her back again. In a world where he curated everything, phrasing, light, emotion, she was the one element that defied calibration. It wasn't that she humiliated him. It was that he allowed it. And that raised the question Rome never dared ask. Was the master of emotional control emotionally free? Or was he just as entangled as the empire he helped pacify? In the garden he designed for harmony, she was the note that stayed dissonant, and he couldn't or wouldn't resolve it. He'd always been steady. When Augustus raged, Maecenas stayed calm. When Rome burned with ambition, he poured moderation into its wine. But after Terentia's final betrayal, he began to shift. He withdrew for weeks, dismissed guests with little explanation. Letters went unanswered. Poets left his circle. Augustus noticed. Decisions delayed. Tensions grew. The emotional thermostat of the regime, always regulated by Maecenas, flickered because he wasn't just a man. He was a pressure valve. And now, grief had rusted it shut. The system he helped design, quiet influence, soft guidance, emotional intelligence depended entirely on one thing: his balance. And when that slipped, Rome felt it. No riots, no decrees, just a quiet loss of harmony, a tone out of key, reverberating through the machinery of empire. That was the risk no one had planned for. When you build a system on one man's inner calm, what happens when that man fractures? Augustus replaced everyone: generals, advisors, lovers, even friends when needed. Loyalty mattered, but usefulness mattered more. Except with Maecenas. When cracks appeared, when decisions wavered, when the machine of subtle influence began to seize, Augustus didn't cast him aside. He waited. Others stepped in stiffer, louder, more official. They followed rules, they gave orders. And they failed, because Maecenas wasn't an administrator. He was something Rome didn't have a word for: the custodian of feeling. He could read the mood of a population from a few verses and a rumor. He could make Augustus's silence sound like leadership instead of uncertainty. And that couldn't be replicated. Not by training, not by force. Augustus ruled an empire. But he knew there are some forms of power that cannot be commanded, only trusted. And that's what Maecenas was. Not replaceable. Not even fully comprehensible. Just essential. There was no exile, no disgrace, no final scandal to seal a tragic arc. He just faded. The letters slowed. The garden quieted. The poets, once vibrant and sharp, scattered, some to comfort, some to silence, some to safer, duller patrons. Maecenas wasn't pushed out. He drifted out, not because he lost favor, but because the system he'd built had become too heavy to carry alone. The culture he shaped began to calcify. The metaphors became dogma. The gentle guidance curdled into doctrine. He had designed Rome's emotional climate. Now it was running without him. And it no longer needed subtlety. It needed control. Maecenas watched this happen from within his walls. He didn't protest, didn't write a final treatise, because that was never his style. He didn't fall. He dissolved. And in doing so, proved that sometimes power doesn't end in crisis. It ends in quiet obsolescence. He was no longer present. But his absence wasn't emptiness. It was shape. The rhythms he taught Rome still echoed. The calm voice, the careful story, the preference for suggestion over command. But something had changed. The new voices didn't whisper. They instructed. They didn't invite complexity. They managed it. The poets became servants of theme. The narratives narrowed. Beauty was no longer offered. It was required. Without Maecenas, the system endured. But the grace was gone. Augustus still ruled. The empire still expanded. Temples still rose. But Rome's imagination, once fluid, began to harden. And that was Maecenas' true legacy. He had given Rome something it didn't know it needed: emotional agility. Once lost, it wasn't easily recovered. He hadn't just built a voice. He had taught an empire how to listen to itself. And now, it only listened to power. There is no grand statue, no temple, no heroic inscription in stone. Maecenas left nothing to look at. And that, in the end, was the point. He didn't believe in permanence through granite. He believed in resonance, the kind that lingers in tone, in phrasing, in the way a city feels about itself, not just what it builds. When others died, they were measured by what they left behind: wealth, children, titles. When Maecenas died, Rome measured what changed in his absence. Conversations grew narrower. Verse grew flatter. Power grew louder. No one filled his place, because there was no place to fill. Just a pattern, a memory of how different things felt when he was still somewhere in the room. And maybe that's a better kind of monument. Not one you can point to, but one you slowly notice missing. When the sound no longer bends around the same center, he never asked for fame, but his name endured, not as a memory, but as a category. Maecenas stopped meaning Gaius Silnius Maecenas. It started meaning something else. The one who gives so others can create. The patron. The quiet hand behind the public voice. Centuries passed. The empire fell. The temples cracked. But in court after court, in every age where art needed shelter, someone whispered, "He is a Maecenas." Painters, composers, writers, all had patrons, but only the true ones, the shaping ones, got that word. It didn't matter if they knew the man. They knew what the role meant. The word survived because the function survived. Because power always needs beauty. But beauty, if left alone, withers. Maecenas understood that. And now, long after his city vanished, his name still names a kind of generosity that also governs. He wasn't a poet, didn't sculpt, didn't compose. Not a single surviving verse bears his authorship. No treatises, no manifestos, and yet his fingerprints are on everything the Augustan age produced. Because he didn't create art, he created the space where art became possible. He asked the questions that rewrote intent. He saw what a work could mean before the author knew what they were writing. Others gave money. He gave alignment. His genius wasn't in expression, but in orchestration. He tuned people. He pulled sharpness from modest men, humility from radicals, restraint from firebrands. And in doing so, he wrote a voice into Roman history without touching the page. He never called it vision, but it became one. And when the age passed, historians gave it a name, not after the emperor who ruled it, but the man who composed its tone. Empires don't last on swords alone. They need belief, not just in rulers, but in the idea that those rulers belong. Maecenas understood this before anyone else. He didn't just fund poets. He shaped legitimacy. He knew Augustus couldn't rule as Caesar's heir forever. That blood was too raw, too recent. So he helped write a new inheritance, not of lineage, but of fate. Aeneas, Troy, the gods. It wasn't propaganda, it was foundation. And once the myth was strong enough, Augustus didn't have to justify himself. He could simply exist as fulfillment. This was Maecenas' architecture, invisible, durable, made of metaphor and memory. And in that structure, power felt natural, even moral. That's the kind of art he commissioned. Not decoration, but cement. And for all its elegance, its function was clear: to hold up the weight of a system by convincing people it was destiny. Maecenas never ordered anyone. He didn't dictate themes. He didn't issue commands. But influence has gravity, and gravity pulls. The poets around him wrote freely, but somehow they kept orbiting the same virtues: moderation, piety, acceptance, fate. Was that freedom, or just subtle containment? When art is rewarded for alignment, at what point does alignment become expectation? Even when Maecenas meant no harm, his presence bent the air. And that's the question his legacy never fully answers. Can you shape without distorting? Can you guide without narrowing? Rome celebrated his gentleness, but gentleness can still guide a hand away from discomfort, away from revolt, away from truth. He wasn't a tyrant, but he may have built the conditions that made tyranny more poetic. And no empire ever fell, because it was too good at soothing itself. It worked brilliantly. For a while, the poets flourished. The public calmed. Augustus rose on words as much as on victories. But the machine had a flaw. It ran on one man's perception. Maecenas was the judge, the tuner, the filter. He knew what Rome could hear. He knew how far a poem could push. He knew which silences were productive and which were dangerous, and no one else did. When he faltered, emotionally, politically, even subtly, the entire balance shifted. There was no institution beneath him, no second layer, no school of successors, because Maecenas had built something uniquely personal and left no map behind. That's the danger of brilliance. When it becomes system, it also becomes single point of failure. And when the empire began to harden, there was no one left who could soften it again, without sounding weak, because Maecenas hadn't trained a generation. He had just been himself, and that wasn't something you could reproduce. Maecenas never forced anyone. He didn't censor. He didn't imprison. He didn't exile. But Augustus did. And it's worth asking, would the emperor have learned to silence so smoothly if he hadn't first learned how to soothe? Maecenas taught Rome how to accept power, how to see peace as preferable to freedom, how to trade rage for structure, doubt for order, chaos for choreography. And that teaching, however elegant, lowered resistance. So, when the edge of culture became less poetic, when artists stepped out of harmony, Augustus no longer softened them. He simply removed them. Ovid was exiled. Other poets went quiet. And Maecenas? By then, he was already fading. The velvet glove laid gently aside. Once the fist had learned what to do without it, that was never his intention. But sometimes, the softest beginnings lead most efficiently to the firmest ends. Maecenas died quietly. No public farewell, no dramatic last words. Just absence. The empire didn't stop. Augustus still ruled. The provinces paid. The monuments rose. But something fundamental shifted. Rome no longer felt the same. Without him, power grew colder. Poetry became flattery. Silence turned from space to fear. His influence had been invisible, but it had buffered everything, made order seem like comfort, made narrative feel like choice. Now, with him gone, Rome discovered what it had taken for granted, the emotional logic of legitimacy. And once lost, it couldn't be rebuilt. Because Maecenas hadn't left a formula, he was the formula. And what he gave couldn't be codified. It was relational, atmospheric, alive. And empires are not good at keeping what can't be written into law. He had no children, no school of thought, no institutional memory. Maecenas left behind only echoes, and none of them knew where they came from. Later, patrons tried to imitate him. They paid artists, hosted salons, quoted Horace over wine, but it wasn't the same. Because Maecenas hadn't just funded brilliance, he'd curated ambiguity. He let discomfort breathe. He held power close, but never gripped it. Others offered resources. He had offered perspective. That can't be inherited. It can't be templated. It only works if you live it, and if those in power trust you enough to let you live it. Augustus had. No one else would. So the legacy endured, but the patronage that created it became myth. And in time, the myth hardened, as myths do, into something repeatable, but no longer alive. Maecenas had never wanted followers, which is fortunate, because he never got them. He never led, never ruled, never conquered. And yet, for a moment, Rome sounded like him, not in law, but in tone, not in statues, but in how people described what mattered: peace, purpose, restraint, beauty, fate. Maecenas didn't change Rome's structure. He changed its atmosphere. An atmosphere is the hardest thing to hold, the easiest to forget, the most dangerous to lose. He offered a different kind of power, not force, not command, but the art of setting conditions until a civilization reorients itself, without realizing it's been guided. And when he vanished, no one knew how to replicate it. Because what he offered wasn't a method, it was a presence. And that raises the final question. Unanswered, unresolvable. Was Maecenas proof that power can be gentle, or proof that even gentleness can be used to prepare the ground for something far less kind?